fact, there were very few direct taxes ever utilized. So there is this tie, theoretically, but as a practical matter, it didn't really limit. There was the fight over 3/5. And the 3/5 argument, which we know what it was about, in part, is about whether slaves should be counted as property or persons. You will note that the language says persons. The persons drafting the final text were anti-slavery persons who drafted the text. Nowhere in the text is there a reference to slaves as anything other than persons. The text, then, is obviously changed with the 14th Amendment. And the main purpose of the 14th Amendment is to ensure that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are in fact now citizens. And that was significant because the states were the ones who initially decided basically citizenship. And I'll talk about that in the history, because early on states were deciding who was and wasn't a citizen, and they were granting citizenship to people long before they were in fact U.S. citizens. So in the 14th Amendment, you have in the second section, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. What the legal debate comes down to, and largely it's been between myself and Professor Eugene Wallach of UCLA, is whether you take that text in isolation without looking at anything else, and does that mean, therefore, that every human being who happens to be in the United States on the day of the census is automatically not only counted, but is included in apportionment. Our textual argument says, well, you've got some difficulties here. First of all, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons. At the time of the text, persons included corporations, and nobody in their right mind would say that corporations ought to be counted for purposes of apportionment. There's also a problem with Indians not taxed. The text goes on to say, excluding Indians not taxed. Yet in section 1, it says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. It would appear that Indians not taxed should be citizens of the United States by virtue of section 1. If they are citizens by virtue of section 1, then why are they not included in apportionment? Well, when you go back and you look at the history, you understand from the discussions in the Congress that that phrase, not subject to the jurisdiction thereof, excluded, quote, Indians not taxed. Why? Because they were deemed to be citizens of the sovereign Indian nations and therefore separate nationals who were not U.S. citizens. So that is why they're excluded in the Section 2. Section 2 simply cannot completely displace the original language, because you find in Section 2 no reference to the term direct taxes. You have to go to the 16th Amendment before you find the reference to direct taxes. So Congress, in the 16th Amendment, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. But wait a minute. If the 14th Amendment completely displaced this earlier language, then that shouldn't have been an issue at all. That should have been resolved. That's kind of the essence of the textual debate, but there's a historical issue that has to be probed, and that's what we spent a lot of time doing. You actually go back to, as we have, to the records of the Constitution. What you see is that every draft of the original section that uses the term numbers used instead the term inhabitants. And on the last draft, which went to the Committee of Style, they were under instructions to compress and make consistent the text, but they were given no authority to change any meaning. So the language was compressed and instead of number of inhabitants, it ends up being numbers. When Congress thereafter enacts the first census statute, it uses the term inhabitants, and it does so for all the censuses up until the late 19th century. The Federalist repeatedly refers to it as inhabitant. What is the significance of inhabitant? Well, you've taken civil procedure. You know the significance of citizens of a state for purposes of diversity. And what's the test for that? One has to be domiciled. And what does domicile mean? It means that you have to be present and you have to have the intention to permanently stay there. Now, the argument is that people who come into the country and who decide to stay here reside in a particular place, and therefore they are inhabitants. The only problem is that in order to get a visa, other than an immigrant status, you have to declare that you are not intending to permanently stay. In other words, the immigration laws rule out the idea of permanent status unless, in fact, you have the immigrant status. This is where the textual debate is going to come down to. But there will also be something about the history, and this is important to look at because it illuminates that Congress has not only been irresponsible recently, but Congress has a long history of being irresponsible. In the 1920s, you had a census, but you did not have any reapportionment that whole decade. Congress refused to carry out its constitutional duty. And why did they refuse to do so? Because prior to the 1920s, when population shifted, what would happen is that Congress would simply increase the number of representatives so that no state would lose a representative. But they set the number in the 20s at 435. Well, that meant that states were going to lose. There were going to be winners and losers. And that locked the Congress up. And it never did what it was supposed to do. But this is also the decade of immigration turmoil in the Congress. This is when Congress, for the first time, really limits immigration. It is true that in 1882, Congress had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which for the first time limited any group. But it's not till 1920, 1921 that Congress really gets in on immigration and restricts it in a heavy way. So these two issues, although again not constitutionally connected, they in fact get politically connected. By the end of the decade, Congress is looking at the 1930 census, and Congress does what many Congresses has done since, and that is to kick the responsibility to somebody else. For some decades, the Census Bureau had been involved in taking the numbers and collecting the numbers. Originally, it was the U.S. Marshal's Office, but then it moved to the Census Bureau. But with the legislation in 1929, what happens is that they turn everything over to the Census Bureau. The questions, the counting, the allocation. The Congress previously would actually accept the numbers and then decide how the numbers would be allocated. It was a political situation because this is political. What happens is we move the politics out of the Congress, where at least there's some accountability, and we've moved it over to the Census Bureau on the notion that the Census Bureau is somehow apolitical. They're not apolitical, they just have a different politics. They are influenced, and it's been demonstrated, they've been influenced by different pressures. Just this past year, they were influenced by major cities which want to count prisoners.